Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. This is my 2019 review for my top 6 prospects: Daniel Dubois, Efe Ajagba, Filip Hrgovic, Joyce, Arslanbek Makhmudov and Tony Yoka. So I'll go through the year for each, a few brief thoughts, the good, the bad, the what next, and any concerns that I have. But first we'll start with Daniel Dubois, because I think he's had, out of all the prospects, probably the most exposure this year in terms of his 5 fights in the heavyweight division. Didn't always fight the best opposition, but he certainly had some highlight reel KOs. And the 2 wins that stand out for him in 2019, in my view at least, Razvan Kajanu and also Nathan Gorman. The Kajanu fight was meant to be one where he got a test, he got some rounds, a guy in Kajanu who'd fought for a world title. He took Joseph Parker the distance. But uncharacteristically, Kajanu came out swinging. He wanted to actually trade with Dubois, and it was an epic mistake. He was knocked out in 2 rounds. Very good stoppage for Daniel Dubois against Razvan Kajanu. The Nathan Gorman win, that's probably the jewel in the crown for Daniel Dubois in 2019. Very good win against an unbeaten prospect, a stablemate rival. Dubois just really went in there, outclassed him on the back of the jab, and ultimately stopped him in dominating fashion in 5 rounds. That was meant to be something approaching a 50-50 sort of fight, but ultimately Dubois wiped the floor. The other 3 fights for Daniel Dubois in 2019, Richard Lartey, Ebenezer Tete, Kyotaru Fujimoto. Some of those names at the point that Dubois fought them, they were considered mismatches and proved to be so. Fujimoto banged out in a couple of rounds, Tete banged out in 1, Richard Lartey 4 rounds. And that Lartey fight, even though it was a little bit of a shootout for a point in that, or spots in that fight, we did see a few things that we'd been waiting for. How would Daniel Dubois respond if he got clipped on the chin? Richard Lartey came to fight. He came out swinging, and he did catch Daniel Dubois a couple of times, even backing him up at one point, Dubois deciding, actually, I'm going to withdraw from this exchange and start again. So it was good to see him actually tested to some extent, so we know the chin is halfway decent at least, although he really hasn't faced a guy that we can sort of say is a noted puncher in the heavyweight division. Richard Lartey coming into that fight was a virtual unknown in terms of casual fans, and he hadn't faced anyone of note really on his record, so how much punching power he really had, hard to say, but at least he gave Daniel Dubois a bit of a test. And with all these different fights, there were various belts that were put up on the line. For Tete, there was the Commonwealth title, and that kind of justified having that fight. For the Fujimoto fight, the WBC silver title was on the line. And I guess for a lot of boxing fans who'd been sort of seeing Fujimoto's career really stagnating over several years, him going in against Dubois was never going to work, and now he may just disappear from heavyweight boxing altogether. His heart and determination and whether he was really committed to the sport had always been a bit of a question, and Fujimoto himself had said his goal was to have a heavyweight title fight and then disappear from the sport. He never said anything about winning, so make of that what you will. But overall, Daniel Dubois, a pretty decent year, and I like the activity. Obviously, 5 fights is decent for a prospect. He's currently 14-0. He's approaching the next phase of his career now, where he transitions from prospect to fringe contender. 2020 does need to be a year where we see a bit of a step up from Daniel Dubois. And I'm not talking straight into, the toughest fights possible, but there needs to be some progression, because you saw the Kajanu and Gorman fights, and then he sort of went down a little bit of a level to Ebenezer Tete and also Fujimoto. Belts were on the line there, so understandable to some degree. But the question now is, can Frank Warren actually get Dubois some of the fights that he needs for his development? There is no point now of him just going into fights for, minor titles and picking them up, but getting little from the fights. He needs experience. He needs a little bit of adversity. He needs to be tested, because if he goes from certain level fights like Fujimoto, Tete, Lartey, etc., and takes a massive jump, He may not have the experience to deal with whatever's thrown at him at the point in which he has that tougher fight. So I hope Frank Warren does pull out the checkbook, because arguably Daniel Dubois needs to be fighting at that next level. Some of the guys that are sort of top 30-ish, to give him some experience on the way up. Someone like a Christian Hammer would be a good fight. Something of that ilk, I think, is where Daniel Dubois needs to be fighting at in the next year or so. And then possibly he would be on to title contention in 2021, possibly a mandatory shot, possibly through the WBO. But overall, good year for Dubois. I give him an A-. Moving on to the next guy, Efe Ajagba, currently 25 years old, 12-0, had 4 fights in 2019. Amir Mansour, Mikhail Wallish, Ali Erendemiresian and Iago Kaladze. Some of those wins you can take actually a lot from, and I know that there are some fans right now who are a bit down on Efe Ajagba, and some have been labelling him a hype job for being knocked out against Iago Kaladze. And see, this is the difference for me in some of the matchmaking with Ajagba and Dubois. They're matching where they think Efe Ajagba is at this point in his career, with a level of opposition that can test him and give him some rounds and some experience. And you might be thinking, well, hang on, isn't this guy a top-rated prospect? He is, but I actually think on the strength of what we've seen, he's maybe a little bit rawer and greener than maybe people thought he was, where he was going to be at. I think it's become evident that he's still got a ways to go, and he needs to be matched correctly and appropriately to get the rounds and experience that he needs before taking on much tougher tests. And, the Kaladze and Ali Erendemiresian fights, I think we're evidence of that. Some flaws in his game have been exposed, in particular on the defensive end. Doesn't really move his head a lot and seems to get hit a lot as well. They have been talking about that they want him to be slipping punches and being a bit more elusive, but we're yet to see any real evidence that he's developing that side of his game. But having said that, he's a big puncher, he gets some highlight reel knockouts, and he could be a force in the heavyweight division if he's brought along the right way. So I actually didn't mind the matchmaking at all in 2019 for him. The Amir Mansour fight, that was back in March. That was probably the weakest of the 4 fights for him. Mansour 46-ish, something like that at the time that he fought Efe Ajagba. He was taking a paycheck. It was clear that he was on the way out. The Wallish fight was interesting because Wallish did come to fight. He did actually try to put up some resistance. Ultimately, though, he was taken out in 2 rounds, just couldn't take the power. And the fight for me, which I think was good matchmaking and Efe Ajagba got a lot from, was the fight against Ali Erendemiresian, former Olympian who was unbeaten at the time that he fought Ajagba. They really had a good 10-round fight, a good back-and-forth action. Ali Erendemiresian was taking some rounds off him, although the scoring seemed a little wide, but the right man won. Efe Ajagba getting the decision there. The first time that he'd been taken 10 rounds, the first time he'd been taken to a decision. And it did lead to some criticism from some quarters. But for me, seeing him go all 10 rounds, seeing that he could actually put up a pretty high punch volume, it was close to 2,000 punches collectively from both guys in that fight. He showed a good engine there. And also he was able to, adapt a bit in the fight, ultimately beating Demiresian. But he did get a bit hit there, as he did against Iago Kaladze. And that was an exciting fight against Kaladze, one where he made a couple of mistakes. He let Kaladze off the hook when he was hurt, and ultimately he paid for that, getting clipped with a counter right hand and seeing himself on the canvas having to get up and beat a count. And I have seen a lot of people label him, oh, he's a hype job, he's a bum, all this sort of stuff. It's really just nonsense sort of talk. I think what we do need to look at, though, is his current progression and development. And like I sort of said, maybe he's a little bit further behind in his progression than Daniel Dubois, who's looking a little bit more polished. Although, I would say in general, some of the opponents that Ajagba has faced have been, harder propositions than what Dubois has faced. I mean, the likes of Fujimoto, Kaladze, I think, would have knocked him out. Tete, Demiresian probably would have knocked him out. But right fights at the right time, I think, at the moment. And he's getting lessons from these fights. From the Demiresian fight, the Kaladze fight, he's getting rounds and he's actually going to get some valuable experience and lessons. So overall, it was a good year for Efe Ajagba. One where his stock with fans, maybe with some fans, I think dipped a little bit, but I think he got the sort of experience that he's going to need to push him in the gym to improve, because he's found out he is vulnerable to some extent, and he does have some holes that have been exposed in fights that he needs to plug, that he needs to remedy, and he needs to show in upcoming fights in 2020 that he can actually mix it at the top level. And I think in another year, and probably another couple of knockouts, people will be high on Efe Ajagba again, especially if he shows improvement. So overall for Ajagba, based on activity and performance, I'm going to give him a B+. Filip Hrgovic is the next guy. He's 10-0, 27 years old, only had the 3 fights in 2019, which was a little bit disappointing for a guy, obviously a prospect who needs some rounds and some activity. He had a good win in May against Gregory Corbin. That was the first fight on his new co-promotional deal with Matchroom. He probably should have been in the ring earlier in the year, but for whatever reason he wasn't. He stops Corbin within a round. That was actually a good effort, because Corbin previously, just in 2018, had gone 8 bruising rounds with Charles Martin, and Filip Hrgovic stops him inside 60 seconds. Mario Heredia, that was a Matchroom card in Mexico. He stops him in 3 rounds. And Eric Molina, he also stops him in 3 rounds. That was in Saudi Arabia. So he was a road warrior in 2019, traveling all over the place. Overall, in terms of 3 fights, 3 knockouts, you know, it was a decent 2019, but just something about the year just didn't quite sit well for me. The activity, but also he didn't seem to fight nearly as fluid as he has, say, earlier in his career. Something about when he's been coming up in weight. He was 241 for the Molina fight. He was 233 for the Heredia fight, 225 for the Corbin fight. So he's gone up 15 pounds over the course of 2019. And he did look a little bit stiffer, didn't look as fluid. The jab didn't seem to be as effective. And I do think there's a tendency at the moment for Hrgovic to be falling in love with his power, with the right hand, and trying to bang people out of there. And to a point that's going to work against the opposition that he's faced, but the higher up he climbs, he's going to need to get back to his trade, you know, working the jab and having better punch variation. So he had a good year in terms of results with the knockouts, and hopefully he can be into more competitive fights in 2020, because it's clear at 27 years old, with the pedigree from his amateur days, he's ready for bigger and tougher tests. He believes he can beat some of the champions now. But I do think he needs to get back to some of the things that did get people really talking about him as maybe a similar fighter to Vitaly Klitschko, because based on the evidence of this year, didn't really see so much of that sort of comparison. But I do like where Filip Hrgovic is headed. Hopefully they can iron out a few things, and he can have a big 2020. So I am going to give him a B. The next guy, Joyce, he's currently 10-0, 34 years old, 3 fights in 2019. The best of those wins was Bryant Jennings, and arguably of any of the prospects on this list of 6 fighters, I think that is the best win out of any of them. The other wins, Berman Stavern and Alexander Ustinov. In the Stavern fight, I think that's where he picked up the WBA gold title, although it doesn't list that on his box rec, and the gold title puts him above the rankings in the WBA, although he's not recognized by a champion seemingly by the other sanctioning bodies. So he is looking to have the big fights, be in the big fights, but it hasn't quite panned out the sort of way that they had been hoping. When he first turned pro back in 2017, they talked about accelerating him and really getting him into a title fight lickety-split. He started off with some decent opposition, and it's continued. The guys that he's fighting for the current stage of his career, compared to a traditional prospect, he's fighting much better opposition. Bryant Jennings in his 10th fight, that is very good going. Although he did look a little vulnerable in that fight early on, took a shot to the body and he looked badly hurt, but Jennings just didn't pounce on the opportunity. Ultimately, Joyce gets a unanimous decision. Very, very good win, and the best out of any of these prospects in 2019, in my view. But it's seemingly they can't seem to push him along as fast as they would like. They've talked about big fights, but haven't quite landed the ones that they want. And no disrespect to Jennings, very good fighter, but in the scheme of the heavyweight division, he's a sort of top 20 guy at the moment, no higher. They want to be pushing Joyce into a bigger fight, but it just, I don't know if Frank Warren has got the checkbook to do it. He's co-promoted by Frank Warren, has been campaigning in the United Kingdom in 2019, but they do have the option, I guess, at some point of going back to the United States if they think there's an avenue there, because he's also co-promoted by Ringstar's Richard Schaefer, who works with the PBC. So they haven't cut off the avenues, and Joyce at 34 years old needs to keep all options open and take anything with both hands, because his prime will slowly slide away. I mean, I always say heavyweights do their best work before the age of 35. So Joyce needs to get cracking if he wants to achieve something in the heavyweight division. I'm not saying he can't be in fights and win after the age of 35, but just historically, the best heavyweights do their best work before the age of 35. So 2020, what will it bring for him? The fight with Marco Huck, which was meant to be in January, was cancelled. And obviously there's talk of a Daniel Dubois fight. But at this point, it seems unlikely that would be next. I think Frank Warren would want to build towards that instead of just having it in April at the O2. I think it's more likely, if it happens at all, it'll be the back end of 2020. But he needs to be positioning himself for a title, and that requires a big fight or two for Joyce. And like Dubois, can Frank Warren deliver that for Joe Joyce? Because it seems they're off on a bit of an island at Queensbury at the moment, and it doesn't seem like they can get some of the opponents that they would really like to. But I guess with some of the silos that have been forming in the heavyweight division in terms of promotional stables, you know, collecting and hoarding heavyweights within their stables, it's to be expected to some point that it'd be a bit harder to secure some of the ideal fights that would sort of push Joyce along. But he needs a big 2020, and if they really want to get him to a title shot, he needs to really go for broke and have a couple of big fights. Can he get them though? His rating for 2019, a B. The next guy, Arslanbek Makhmudov, the Russian fighting out of Canada, 6'5", 260. He's probably the least known of the prospects on this list, and some of that for me, I believe, is because he has been fighting in Canada, not the UK and not the USA, where I think he would be a much more well-known prospect had he been fighting in those two countries. But Makhmudov, a busy 2019. He had 5 fights. Jason Bergman, Avery Gibson, Jonathan Rice, Julian Fernandez, and Samuel Peter. Some of the opposition there, not fantastic. Samuel Peter faded beyond belief. Julian Fernandez, he was a late replacement opponent. That win over Jonathan Rice was actually quite a good one, because Rice, a mover, he gave Makhmudov something to think about. Took him 7 rounds, the most in his career. Ultimately, Makhmudov caught up with him and stopped him. Also, that win against Avery Gibson was the first time Gibson had been stopped in a fight. So Makhmudov, a very big puncher, one of the biggest, hardest punchers in the heavyweight division. But you have to ask the question now for Arslanbek Makhmudov. At 10-0, and with some of the recent matchmaking, it's clear that they're maxing out on the guys that they can get to Canada, Peter and Julian Fernandez, etc. Should he be moving on to somewhere else, a co-promotional deal, he probably needs to go somewhere else just to get the sort of fights that he needs to be in, to get himself into a position for an eventual world title shot, should it go that way. I just can't see how he can get it from being just competing in Canada. He needs to, in my view, move further afield, probably in 2020 for the betterment of his career. But a decent 2019, and I think by this time next year, the end of 2020, I think a lot more people will know the name Arslanbek Makhmudov. Big puncher. He lacks a little bit of variation at times. He's very sort of, you know, right hand, right uppercut, sort of heavy. Not a lot of variation, and that could catch him out later in his career. Ultimately, if people know where the punches are going to be coming from, they can plan for it. So variation will be key, and he needs probably some more fights against other movers like Jonathan Rice, but guys that are just maybe a cut above where Rice is at. Those sorts of tests will be good for him, because some of the guys in the heavyweight division will probably give him issues, you know, through their movement and try to pick him apart. But overall, a decent year. I'll give him a B. And Tony Yoka, he is the final prospect on my list. 27 years old, 7-0. He had 2 fights in 2019. And it'll be a little bit hard for me to give him a massively high rating off the back of the limited activity. Part of that was brought about, he was on a 1-year ban up until about mid-June. That was for missing drug testing. So he hadn't failed the test, but he had missed multiple testing dates. So make of that what you will. But in terms of Yoker, the 2016 gold medalist, on his return, he continued his way of fighting decent level opposition. First fight back in July, Alexander Dimitrenko. He's a high level gatekeeper that a number of top heavyweights have beaten over the years. And Yoker did a good job stopping him in 3, although it looked like Dimitrenko was trying to look for a way out. And the other fight on his resume for 2019 was Mikhail Wallisch. So he fought Wallisch, as did Ajagba in 2019. Both stopped him in 3 rounds. And you could maybe argue that the performance by Yoker against Wallisch was a little bit more polished than the one from Ajagba, which was more sort of raw sort of aggression and power. Yoker was a little bit more nuanced in his performance, and more finesse there. Ultimately, he did catch up with Wallisch and landed some heavy blows. And Tony Yoka is one of these guys who's definitely slipping under the radar. Part of that was the year out of the ring, but also he's been fighting and competing in France. At some point, he's going to need to leave the nest, go elsewhere. He's promoted by Ringstar at the moment by Richard Schaefer. Perhaps they need to get him over to the United States or something like that, because I don't believe he can keep competing in France and hope to have some sort of title fight land in that country. I just think that's a more remote possibility. Not impossible, but it would take probably considerably longer than he would probably expect it to. So we may see him go somewhere else in 2020 in terms of where he's fighting. And I don't think that's actually a bad thing for his career. And he, of all the guys on this list, might be the most polished in terms of where he's at and the sort of fights that he's ready for. Him and Filip Hrgovic seem to be ready for the much tougher test, and Daniel Dubois is not far behind that as well. But Yoker, yeah, certainly ready for much bigger fights. He looked good against Dimitrenko and Wallisch. Because of the activity, the 2 fights, they were good wins. He was meant to face Christian Hammer in December, but that fell apart. If he had have fought against Hammer, and that's a good fight for anyone on this list, I probably would have given him a B+ or an A-, but because of just the 2 fights, a B- for Yoker, but definitely a guy to watch in 2020. All these guys, I believe, in 2019, for the most part, lived up to the hype and buzz that is surrounding them, and that they proved against certain opponents that, you know, they can be a force in the heavyweight division. Are they the finished product? No. So you are going to have spots, say like Efe Ajagba, but we go through some adversity. And remember, you want these guys to be getting tests and, you know, a bit of adversity at this point in their career for the experience, so they can bring that into tougher fights later in their career. It can be beneficial for them. But yeah, a good year for these top 6 prospects. Maybe Daniel Dubois edged ahead of his competitors just in terms of the activity, the headlines that he garnered, the highlight reel knockouts and a couple of decent wins, but the others not far behind. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.